Good evening and welcome to the public lecture series at the National Humanities Center. I'm Robert Newman, the president and director of the center. And it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Celeste-Marie Bernier is personal chair in English literature and professor of Black Studies at the University of Edinburgh and principal researcher at the Center for Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and was previously chair of African American Studies at the University of Nottingham. She's also co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of American Studies, published by Cambridge University Press. A specialist in the literatures, histories, politics, visual cultures, and philosophies of men, women, and children living in the African diaspora over the centuries, Professor Bernier's research touches on a wide variety of subject areas, and her writing on these subjects is perhaps best described as prodigious. She is the author of 3 widely praised books and co-author of a 4th, all of which have appeared in the last 8 years. And she's currently working on 3 new books, all under contract, on issues of cultural representation among African American and Black British artists over the past 2 centuries up to the present moment. Her volume, Characters of Blood, Black Heroism and the Transatlantic Imagination, published in 2014, which received the British Association for American Studies Book Prize and was joint winner of the European Association for American Studies Network Book Prize, was noted for its original and generative approach to understanding works of literature and the arts. As one recommender for her fellowship noted, Professor Bernier's books and articles are valuable in themselves as works of original scholarship, but they also perform important work in helping define the entire field of study of African American art and visual culture. This year, as John Hope Franklin Fellow at the Center, she's turning her attention to the remarkable life and work of Frederick Douglass, examining his contributions as activist, author, and thinker through a variety of lenses: historical, cultural, aesthetic, sociological, philosophical, to help us better understand his immense impact on our cultural, political, and intellectual landscape. Please join me in welcoming Celeste-Marie Bernier this evening as she presents Lexicon of Liberation, Imaging Slavery, and Imagining Freedom in the African Atlantic Diaspora.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all so much for being here. I'm guessing this is a cold night by North Carolina standards. For my friends back in Scotland, this is tropical, so for us it's very beautifully warm. But I appreciate it, and so thank you very, very much. Tonight, I'm going to talk on the subject of a lexicon of liberation, imaging slavery, and imagining freedom. I come from another country, the country of the slave. Sojourner Truth. I must go back to the days of my infancy, even to before I was born. Nathaniel Turner. I am resolved that it is better to die than to be a white man's slave, Sengbe Pei. No one shall take me back alive. I shall die fighting for my liberty, Harriet Tubman. I am only the painter, and I am one going to war without weapons, Frederick Douglass. So tonight, in beginning to think around the question of liberation and to think around what's at stake in life and death terms between the fight for life in the face of death, political, social, cultural, ideological, and philosophical, the question remains in thinking around enslaved and free women, children, and men living and dying across the African diaspora, is to think of those who survive, the Tubmans, the Truths, the Douglasses, and to think of those who die nameless, faceless, and bodiless. So as scholars, our responsibility is to think around failure, to think about the moments in the archive controlled by white supremacist power, to think of the ways in which those archives invisibilize, dehumanize, and annihilate. At the center of my work over this period and in my whole life really has been this question of power and how we think around questions of visualizing Black to white supremacy that bleeds through every arena of life as lived across the diaspora. As I've mentioned, it affects us historically, politically, culturally, ideologically, and as Douglas and everyone I speak about tonight, also imaginatively. One of the questions that Douglas felt throughout his life, as did his family members, as did the millions who have left in slavery, and all they've left us are archaeological remains, things that are not the written text of the victors, was that language has no power. Images are mute. And so for Douglas and millions more, and those 60 million or more buried at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, the question remains, how do we do justice to lives lived in that moment? How do we as scholars take up the burden of interpretation when on pain of death, for generations and for centuries, individuals have been living and continue to die, especially at this present moment, in a dystopian reality in which utopian possibilities remain ones to be fought for? The lexicon of liberation that I speak of tonight is the one imagined by Donald Rodney, who died far too young, as he thought about ways in which we can begin to describe what is a Black lexicon of liberation. Winfried Rembert was an artist who was born in Cuthbert, Georgia, and what you're looking at here is one of his cotton paintings that he made in the 1990s. He was born in the 1940s, and he experienced the devastating impact of segregation, the devastating impact of labor and inequalities as he and his family fought for day-to-day existence. What you're looking at is one of his paintings that he created through dyeing techniques, and it's not on canvas, it's on leather. Winfried Rembert took as his inspiration the moment of song in the cotton fields, the moment of labor, but of artistry. And at the heart of all the work that I've done over these decades is to begin to think about this question of artistry, agency, and authority, this question of visualizing Black. Now, Winfried Rembert's technique is to impose, as you look here and you look onto the score of Amazing Grace. Now, one of those apocryphal moments in slave trading history is that of John Newton. John Newton, one of the most infamous white British slave traders before he found God, who used to pack human beings into the shackle holds of ships like, and these are his words, books upon a shelf. At that moment of epiphany, where he finds God and he moves out from slave ship holding, he composes Amazing Grace. And the traditions in his family history and the traditions that have come down to us are that as he composed Amazing Grace, he remembered the wailing and the suffering sounds of the women, children, and men shackled below deck. So as we think of Amazing Grace, we yet again think of white spiritual freedom inscribed on Black physical incarceration. At this moment, Winfried Rembert is memorializing the struggle of his family, the fight for existence. For those of you who have good eyesight, you'll be able to see he's coated the floor in green and gold. His evocation, as he describes it, of the greenbacks of white capitalist commerce on Black subjugation. Now, Winfried Rembert is a man with a story. He fought for the civil rights movement. He marched in every march that he could. He was a radical activist, and he took part in every dissident movement. One night, he's involved in a march in Alabama, and he's incarcerated by white police officers. He tries to escape them because he knows they're going to kill him. They've just killed his friend. He runs, he hotwires a car, he's caught up by police, and they put him in overnight jail. Not to be content with that, Winfried Rembert blocks the toilet, has the white police officer, come to his cell, and he overpowers him, and he runs in the dead of night. Now, running in the dead of night as an African-American male gives you one outcome. He's overcome by the Klan. The Klan take him, they put him in the boot of their car, they take him to a forest outside of the area that he's in, and they string him up by his feet, and they cut him preparatory to castration, and he lives. Winfried Rembert comes so close to dying through lynching, but he lives. Yet this moment is something he immortalizes in paint. So for 30 years, he lives with this story and he speaks not of it. He says nothing about the tragedy and the traumas he experienced. He has only the nightmares that keep him awake at night. Yet, as a result of incarceration, unjust policing, ongoing brutality, he remains on the chain gang, cut down from the tree, not castrated. He lives only to serve incarcerating and dehumanizing suffering on the chain gang, where he learns to paint his stories in leather. So what you're looking at here is a triptych of paintings that he did. It was meant to be 45. He had to give up after 3. Because the struggle and the endurance and the difficulty was too much in order to tell this story. So as you look, you see 6 figures hanging, 2 have been cut down. These are memories not of his own lynching, which he's yet to immortalize in paint. These are memories of the lynching he attended as a child, enforced attendance through white authority figures in the small town that he grew up in, Cuthbert. And as you notice here, there are 7 grave sites. 1 for burying humanity. So for Winfried Rembert, the question is one of art as the battleground. He talks about art as the source of life. And one of the questions that I have over the 20 years is, how do we as human beings do justice to atrocities that are unspeakable? How do we do justice to experiences where, as Douglas described, as I've said already, that moment of losing his mother, he said, images were mute and words failed me. What do we do when language and words fail us in beginning to do justice to lives as lived on the site of white atrocity? And so Winfried Rembert's answer is to paint, to engage in visual storytelling. And he's joined by millions more. And he's joined by millions upon millions more, dating right back on from 1619 and before, who found ways to resist in the face of utter annihilation and subjugation, agency in the face of dispossession. So you notice Winfried Rembert sits here with a painting behind him in which there's an empty chair. And one of the powerful moments in his artwork is really about presence and absence. How does he speak to and speak for those who stayed in that area, those who didn't make it out, those who didn't survive, and for whom the Klan came, and that was the end of the story? And this is no less a question for somebody else over 150 years, who I hardly need say to you, is Frederick Douglass, born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. Now, Frederick Douglass, like Winfried Rembert, understands that racism, as does slavery, takes many forms. And he consistently maintained throughout his life, my part has been to tell the story of the slave, the story of the master never wanted for any narrators. Frederick Douglass felt consistently that African-American lives and African diasporic lives as lived in chattel slavery were ones in which the onus was on liberating yourself, not only from being bought and sold on the pro-slavery auction block, but being bought and sold on the abolitionist podium. Frederick Douglass felt that it was a lifelong war for freedom, imaginative, let alone corporeal. And he had a philosophy of thinking through the ways in which Black existence could live and be transformed. And he spoke repeatedly of his opposition to chattel records. He waged a lifelong war, not only as an activist, but as a historian and a memorialist, to putting the Black archive back in the official dominant record. And he described it as a way of righting the wrongs of the chattel record of white supremacy. His other moment was to visualize Black by resisting his white abolitionist sponsors. Douglass was repeatedly told to tell your story, Frederick. Do not make it too descriptive. Try and use some plantation speech, if possible. You're a brand new fact, the first one out. To which Douglass repeatedly said, I will speak the word only to be spoken by me. So Douglass consistently was mindful of the burden of representation, of those he had left behind, of those who didn't make it out, the survivors versus those who were left in slavery. And he talks about their lives as living parchments. So at the moment when Granville Sharp, to genteel white ladies drinking tea in Bath and feeling philanthropic for the ills of the world, keeping paternalism intact and not violating their social order of things, we're being shown shackles, we're being shown whips with human hair, we're invited to express their horror through voyeurism, Douglass described black bodies as living parchments. We are authors of our destiny. We are manuscripts in the making. We are storytellers. We are not objects to be bought and weighed and valued on auctioneers' lists. Similarly, we are not objects to be paraded, bodies of evidence, proof for the end of slavery. We are capable of forging our own lexicon of liberation. And he argued from that point onward, not only were they living parchments, but they were works of art. And what you're looking at here is one of Douglass's earliest photographs in which he uses his face and body to signify the struggle of Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey that lived on through Frederick Douglass. One of the moments that is very little discussed, because Douglass himself sought to conceal it, was the extent to which he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. I've spoken about how Winfried Rembert lived back into the battlefield. Similarly, for Frederick Douglass, he endlessly spoke in private writings, "There was no living for me. So must I live in misery, and so must I die." So Douglass is living very much a living vindication of the words of Audre Lorde that we all know so well, where she writes repeatedly and powerfully, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." As Douglass knew, as the woman incarcerated in 1619 knew, as the woman in 1518 in Sierra Leone knew, maybe the slaves will. So for Douglass and others, the question and the burden, if you made it out of slavery, was that in order to fulfill white criteria, and this is white criteria of authenticity, you had to perform as how to look like a slave and talk like a slave. And what you see Frederick Douglass doing here is inverting that white supremacist lens. He's taking control of power. He's navigating and looking at you and showing how a slave looks and how a slave sees. One day, when talking quietly, this is Douglass in his 70s, Mr. Douglass recalled how before speaking to the audience who gathered at anti-slavery meetings, he would always ask to be alone. This is 1840s. His preparation was to recall the horrors and cruelties suffered by those he left behind in slavery. It all would rise up before him like an actual presence, and the audience would shiver with the sympathy he displayed. His preparation was to recall the horrors and cruelties suffered by those he had left behind. So the question of the burden of representation, the burden of memorialization, how to do justice to the stories and lives for those where there is no record, how to work and begin to think through the realities of existence for those who are beyond the pale of white supremacist doctrine and of amnesia in national memory, let alone communal memory. We have to use every means necessary. We have to use every scholarly mode necessary. We have to use every theoretical framework necessary as we pay homage to and respectfully work with the burden of representation that becomes the burden of interpretation as historians, thinkers, and philosophers. One of the questions to which Douglass repeatedly returned was the question, "My back is scarred with the lash. That I could show you, but I could make visible the wounds on my soul. I could make visible the wounds on my soul." When you look at this image, and I'm sure in your mind's eye you can think back to that, you may have seen them, they're in all kinds of museum exhibitions, popular reproductions, historical moments in Black History Month. We get to see some of these images again. I've purposefully left all of them out. Typically the exhibition of the scarred backs, the struggles, the suffering, the mutilated bodies of slavery. Douglass had one such back, but yet he never showed it. So the question around how Douglass sought to be portrayed was to confront his audiences with this very much this iconic representative of an inner via an outer life. Douglass, as we all know, and those of you who know his work or know him or know a great deal about him, will know that Douglass loved music. And you'll know that Douglass spoke endlessly of white ignorance when it came to black music. He spoke of white visitors to plantations in the South who would misinterpret, and these are his words, the wild songs of slaves as signifiers of happiness and contentment. He says that nothing, and he said persistently until the day that he died, nothing remembers me of the struggles I went through slavery than hearing those old songs. They send a thrill to my soul. So Douglass had this theory of sorrow songs. He also had a theory of sorrow images. For Douglass, one of the most important ways in which he would visualize himself was to visualize black to images like this one, and I show only this one. There's an industry of images which I'm purposefully excluding. Douglass visualized black to images like these, and he wrote to Richard Webb, his Irish publisher, in 1846, and he said, "I dislike this image. I denounce it without heat or thunder. It is not the face of the fugitive slave." So Douglass was preoccupied in his self-memorialization of bearing the burden of the face of the fugitive slave. And he engaged in various techniques. He uses minimal backdrops. Typically, Frederick Douglass excludes any kind of symbolic properties. He is never in a domestic setting in his photography. He very much instructed the photographer. As we all know, white photographic and Daguerrean technology is very much rooted in white racist conceptions of skin tone. Douglass endlessly came in and choreographed and reversed and very much interfered with that process to ensure that his skin was lit a particular way. He also paid close attention to his clothing. I don't know how familiar you are with 19th century daguerreotype portraits. People did not look like this when they came to the studio. And part of that is someone else's artistry, Anna Murray Douglass, who ensured that Douglass, when he performed, would send on fresh linen, and herself, a beautiful, accomplished seamstress, would ensure that he always looked immaculate. Now, Douglass's conception with photography, that moment of moving from a living parchment to a work of art, was precisely to get at the question, as he described it, of the inner via the outer man. Daguerrean technology that involved a face enclasped in a book-like structure for Douglass was about rekindling and recapturing the imaginative inner life of a free individual. So Douglass's philosophy, as you see it here, is to psychologically confront you with his imaginative and cerebral power. So for Douglass, the portrait remained a site of contestation, and it remained a site of empowerment and a site of self-definition. I wanted to share with you something very rare. So this is a very early hand-drawn portrait of Douglass. It's contemporaneous with Douglass at that moment, so it's late 1840s. We don't know the artist. My hunch and conviction is it's Robert Douglass, a close friend of his who was an African-American artist whom he patronized in the pages of the North Star. And it's one of those most beautiful early images of Douglass. It's also one of the early images he kept hold of. So at the same time that Douglass had a messianic belief in photography and self-imaging, he had an absolute disdain of artistic renderings of his face and body. So this is one of the very few images that survive, that's why I'd like to share it with you, of Douglass, taken from a missing daguerreotype, where you see the furrowed brow and his constant preoccupation with the cross-like furrow in his skin being visible. You typically see him later too. There's moments where Douglass hides his developed musculature of his hands, other moments where he accentuates it. And here you see him accentuating it to fuse the idea of the laborer and the intellectual, the self-made man writ large. And here I share a very powerful and a very moving photograph that has nowhere yet been published, and we found after the one book that I did that we worked on that came out. This is Douglass, misidentified as Douglass with Rosetta, his firstborn daughter. In fact, this is Douglass with Annie who died at the age of 10 in the wake of John Brown's revolutionary raid on Harper's Ferry. Here you see Douglass in the only surviving photograph with one of his daughters or sons. The The only others are with Joseph, his grandson. And you see his daughter, Annie, wearing clothing that very likely Anna Murray or Rosetta, who was also an accomplished dressmaker, would have made for her. So the question of self-artistry, self-fashioning, and self-imaging remained at the heart of 19th century strategies of resistance, as they do today. So Frederick Douglass was one who engaged in photography, as well as many other forms of artistry and activism, to begin to bring words and power where images were previously moot. Similarly, Sojourner Truth had a photographic industry in which she portrayed herself in multiple ways, and which she spoke repeatedly, I sell the shadow to support the substance. I sell the corporeal to preserve the spiritual. And among the many individuals who are interested in photography is a woman who I've mentioned already, Harriet Tubman. This is a very recent unearthing of a photograph of Tubman in her 40s. At the moment of the Civil War, it's just been authenticated. It's a very exciting find. We all know Harriet Tubman as the individual who was a freedom fighter and liberator and commander, the General Tubman, as John Brown described her, of the Underground Railroad. What we don't know we know a lot less about, is her existence as an accomplished quilter and dressmaker. As she ran, as she took women, men, children, and babies from plantations on the journey northward, she would make and she would sew quilts. And here you see her engaged in her own moment of self-fashioning and artistry. Harriet Tubman was very interesting when asked about artistic renderings of slavery. She was asked, so Miss Tubman, how do you feel about our now revisiting the history of slavery? And she said, I have no reason to revisit it. I saw the real thing. This question of artistry in the face of oppression is one that haunts a very important painter of the 20th century, Horace Pippin. Horace Pippin, drawing on oral memories in his own family of life in Virginia decades and centuries previously, did a whole series of paintings honoring the quilts and also honoring here the rugs and the color patterning that inspired him throughout his painterly practice. Horace Pippin was an individual who fought in World War I. He was one of the 42,000 combat servicemen who didn't fight in what the African Americans who did fight in them described as the slave battalions, the 160,000 who were consigned to burying the dead and re-importing trenches under shell fire. He fought, he had rifles, he worked in a regiment where initially they had to train with broomsticks because white supremacists couldn't handle them with guns, but he fought and he became an accomplished sniper. Pippin chose to be represented like this, as does Frederick Douglass, erect form, focus on cerebral power, a self-representation. You see him with his military pin. This was how his white racist sponsors wanted to represent him. Pippin had fought in World War I. He'd been struck down by shrapnel from a German sniper. He'd nearly died. He lost the use of his right arm, except he moved it with his hand. Here you see the white racist choreographers very much focused on him foregrounding his disability. And yet for Pippin, there were many no man's lands. So the struggle that Douglass speaks of representation and reimagining, lives on for Pippin in World War I. So he faced death and destruction in the Argonne Forest as he fights for his life against European atrocities. He also remembers, and he's seen, reproductions of slave ship holds from the 18th century that were drawn by naval surgeons. What you're looking at here is his recreation of the Napoleon barracks, which was infamously used for the African-American combat troops in his regiment. Disproportionate numbers died due to the insanitary conditions and the general dilapidation. And here Pippin is immortalizing and memorializing lives packed like books upon the shelf in the 18th century and bought and sold during military warfare in the 20th century. And yet slavery haunted his consciousness. So for Pippin, the no man's land of representation was as much a battle as the no man's land of the battlefield. And he spoke repeatedly and he experimented endlessly with ways to reimagine and rethink the experiences of his family members. What you're looking at, again, like Winfried Rembert, no use of canvas here, is you're looking at a disused wooden panel. So he recycled wooden panels and he used pokers to burn hot lines into the contours of his compositions. So as an individual who initially had no feeling in his right arm, he was a trained professional painter beforehand, he had to relearn after his disability, he uses hot burnished lines to figure the silhouetted figures. For Pippin, white skin is always sepulchral white. It's death-like white, and it's associated with murder, vengeance, and struggle. So the question of bearing ancestors, the question of bearing witness and how we bear witness and how we deal with iconic legendary figures whose names we remember was very much backed by those that we don't. And so in looking at archives and working with materials and thinking through what we have, we endlessly encounter difficulties and loss. One of those areas is the Gee's Bend quilters of Alabama. So whilst we beautifully and wonderfully and inspirationally have all the quilters working now and those in the 20th century, they very self-consciously reworked and recycled those that were created by enslaved women and free women in the 19th and 18th centuries. But those quilts are lost. But what you have as you look at one of these quilts here, and these are work clothes quilts that I'm showing you here, as we think about self-fashioning, self-representation, material culture, and the different ways this is signified across all the examples I've showed you so far, here you have Mary Lee Bendolph talking about this quilt. People can't help but feel the history because they see what their old parents went through in the old quilt. They see that resentment and hurt. It stick to the skin and make them feel sad and sorry. And this is Alonzia, the daughter of Missouri Petway, talking about Missouri Petway's quilt that was made at the same time as the Horace Pippin painting I showed you in 1942. It was when Daddy died, Mama said, I'm going to take his work clothes, shape them into a quilt to remember him, and cover up under it for love. Stories stitched in seams. Stories that are unspeakable and unsayable outside genealogy and communal family traditions, but yet they survive and they endure. As you look at quilts such as these, you see the work in them. You see what Lonnie Holly, Thornton Dial, and many more talk of, the spirits in the quilts. As Betty Saar talks about it, we were mostly about survival. This question of struggle and storytelling and memory, and those of you who've seen these quilts in galleries, what happens when a quilt goes from the bed to become an icon in a gallery, how they function as monuments to loss, as they stand in for surrogates of stories of struggle, yet of survival. As Jacob Lawrence said, struggle is a beautiful thing. And for Leonardo Drew, nothing could be more powerful as he takes cotton sacks, recreates them, distresses them. One of his practices is about introducing decay into work to talk about mortality and loss. And he speaks of it as my labor is my art as I bear the weight of my ancestry. For Thornton Dial, an artist who passed away only very recently, he spoke out endlessly against the white racism of the commodification of his work in the art world. He spoke about white dealers being like white slave auctioneers. And he describes the war auctioneer in this that you look at, you see them to the left of the canvas, straining out with tentacles of like arms. He describes it, the price of a dial ain't no different to a cow or an ox or a slave during slavery. But, he says, look and watch. In the bottom right, that tiger is coming and going to break free. Renee Cox is an artist who takes us out of our comfort zone. These are her words, to get us to confront difficulties. Here you see her using her new body, and as we know through Western art history, the ways in which Black women's bodies have been commodified, dehumanized, violated, and all round subjected to oppressive subjugation and misinterpretation, Renee Cox reclaims the body as a site of agency in the face of struggle. A playful satirist, a radical thinker, a transgressive freedom fighter in her activism, let alone her artistry. You see her showing her hands and raising them up to you as they're codified in white chains, yet the silhouette behind her represents a rifle. For Claudette Johnson, an artist working on a monumental scale and to absolute poverty and neglect, she's an artist who creates absolutely beautiful portraits of women she knows. She writes extensively, the art of Black women has been buried, hidden, disguised. I show stories born of shock. As you look here, you see that she's purposefully distressed the paper to engage with ideas of scarification and wounding, yet nonetheless survival. This is a work that she did only very recently in response to police brutality happening worldwide to show the extent to which violation, suffering, and struggle of Black men walking the streets who are subjected to violation and violence. What you're looking at and what he's pointed to are the 7 bullet scars inflicted by police. Rotimi Fani-Kayode, born in Nigeria, uses his own body before his death to speak to the cargo of Middle Passage, a different reiteration to Horace Pippin. You see him using his body to literally become the triangular trade. He also prevents you from looking at him. The direct confrontation that Douglas supports and applauds becomes a site of controversy and difficulty. In order to engage with the struggle and the enormity of the Middle Passage, he drenches his canvas in a blood-red filter. For Lubaina Hamid, an artist working in Britain, born in Zanzibar, the question of slavery is very much a pressing one, as we deal with the fact that Britain is bled through brick by the profits of the slave trade. She works in the north of England, and she works with crockery that is owned by white slave trading families, and she reimagines individuals whose names she puts on the bottom of the crockery. She calls it a process of overpainting. She also says, there is no point in making ugly art. The subject is already ugly. You could never be as ugly as the hold of a slave ship, as branding, as rape, as blood-stained bodies. For Tam Joseph, an artist born in the Dominican Republic, migrating to London in the mid-20th century, he's very interested in the fact of the failure, how we can't represent. And what you see here in his canvas, Under the Sea, he's taken newspaper pages from the Black Panther newspaper and collaged them over, so all we're left with is the sea and a sense of loss. As he writes, "This is my ode to those who didn't survive." Joginda Lambar is an artist born in Kenya, and he goes to a very special kind of salvage wood for his inspiration. He is the only artist currently to work with slave ship timber. So one of the great things that the British nation did when it became too shameful to admit to the history of slavery, we smashed them all up in World War I through the ways in which we used them in armed warfare. So there's no trace of any slave ships. That gets rid of that, and we can carry on with our happy amnesia. What Joginda Lambar does is he goes into warehouses that were historically the places in which slave ships from where they left, out of Whitehaven, Lancaster, let alone the iconic places in Liverpool and Bristol, and he uses the timber. When I interviewed him, I had chills down my spine because he says, as I work on this timber, it screams. There is torture, anguish, and greater pain. It is as if all the human horror and tragedy of the slave ships permeates the very timbers. For Lambar, the question of the bolts of the slave ship hull become very powerful as metaphors of struggle and survival. For Marlena Smith, an artist working with sculpture, you see her enlarged sculpture of Sojourner Truth here. This is one of the only surviving sculptures that she did that had a very short shelf life as it was destroyed by her white male classmates. The reason, she was using too much clay. Maud Salter is an artist who died prematurely. She visited James Island and she visited the slave ship holding cells there. What she was struck by was les bijoux, the broken fragments of jewelry that attested to the women who had been incarcerated there. So inspired by that, she did a series of self-portraits in which she reconfigured the jewelry. And her interest was in dealing with Black female bodies as sites of violation and violence, but also of agency and artistry. We feel the need to fight. Our life is a constant battle. She who rewrites her story rewrites history. I don't know how familiar you are with trade manuals from the 18th century that were distributed in Birmingham in the UK and sold to Caribbean planters and also to US planters, but they were prolific and they were a big industry. In those various manuals, you would have diagrams of head restraints, shackles you could buy. And what you're looking at here is Maud Salter's visualizing Black to that iconography of dispossession. Donald Rodney, who inspired my title today and who continues to inspire everything I do, was an artist again who died prematurely young. Donald Rodney was born in Birmingham in Smethwick, experiencing horrific racism as a young child and also extreme physical struggle through the fact of suffering from sickle cell anemia. What you're looking at is one of his most powerful sculptures called Visceral Canker. It's about a disease in the body politic. It's his way of speaking of Britain as a corrupt nation, profiting off the bodies and souls of women, men, and children. As you look here, this is the installation that he did in Plymouth Battery, which is the area, the military embarkments in Plymouth, which is where John Hawkins took his first alleged slave ship expedition. I say alleged very carefully. As many of you may know in this room, John Hawkins, as a moment of complete violation and subjugation of black people, decided to take a new heraldry for his coat of arms. And you see Donald Rodney satirically engaging with that here. And if you have any questions about the coat of arms and the heraldry, I'd be very happy to answer them. Many of them I can't, though, because of the ways in which the coat of arms institution operates to this day. This is not a told story. What Donald Rodney wanted to do, what he was prevented to do, was he wanted to circulate his own blood in the tubing you see here. He was prevented and he nearly withdrew the exhibition. Donald Rodney was convinced about the question of memorialization. So as quilts are surrogate memorials to graves and lives lost, he was fascinated by memory jars. And as he was dying, he was interested in using his own hair and milk to reconfigure and revisit the African diasporic memorial jars, those that functioned where graves were denied. Keith Piper is a satirist, a trickster, as he describes himself. And in 2007, in Britain, we like to very much memorialize white abolition rather than black slavery. You see him commenting on that amnesia. This is a series of vitrines he did called Lost Vitrines. On the left, what you're looking at is what, from a distance, looks like an 18th century medicine cabinet. He's very much an artist, he's a trickster, hidden in plain sight. But up close is Miss Mary's micro-resistance toolkit. How to survive the plantation. What looks from a distance like a European architectural plans, up close is Sengbe Pei, mythologies for smashing and burning. Equally, a field hand's guide to the destabilization of plantations. For Joy Gregory, the question is very much about storytelling through fragments of history. As you notice here, she engages with the realities of the slave trade on British shores at the same time that she acknowledges the resistance movements and the long history. Vanley Burke is a photographer who got so sick of images of atrocity, he turned to objects. He commissioned a blacksmith working in inner city Birmingham to recreate the shackles of the trade. His argument being, if you can't deal with the language, an object will leave you with an understanding of the experience. For Kimathi Donkor, an artist working also in Britain in the south of England, he's an artist who's been repeatedly stopped and searched, so a great deal of his work is about that humiliation and that struggle. But in this work, he memorializes Harriet Tubman's moment of go on or die. This came from a moment when he was in a hospital working with Jamaican women who were in that hospital, many suffering from terminal as well as serious illnesses, and he was awed at their power and resilience in the face of their struggling and suffering. For Beverly Buchanan, she's an artist who's engaged with revisiting shacks, as she describes them, as portraits to survival. She's very much about bringing the gardens, that site that's often written out of the history of slavery, as a moment of creativity and artistry in black lives, back into the historical record. Emma Amos takes the shack as a moment to meditate on her own self-portrait and the question of visibility. Alison Saar is an artist who works very powerfully with loss and destruction, lynching, blood, sweat, and tears, yet the promise of liberation through spiritual release. Working out of Atlanta, Radcliffe Bailey describes himself as a family historian as he uses piano keys to tell that sorrow song of the Middle Passage. Nellie Mae Rowe, growing up, having to work in cotton fields, had no chance to be an artist, turned to play and child's imagination to restore the play and childhood denied her. Whitfield Lovell works in areas of gentrification as white supremacist forces elude, dehumanize black communities. He describes this as the skin remembers. Myra Green revisits ambrotypes from the 1840s, the technology that was used by J.T. Zeeley to immortalize African types as he violated the subjectivities of Delia, Drana, and her fathers in the South Carolinian plantation, to talk about I Am a Slave. Clarissa Sly is an artist working right now who has just this month published a book of a transforming hate. And her mantra is, I will not replace hate with hate. Her question is, can hate be transformed? For Pat Ward-Williams, her interest here in revisiting a fragment of a lynching that was photographed and reproduced in Life magazine as one of the top 10 images, to much of great disturbing horror as she saw it, she writes, can I construct the unsayable, the unspeakable, and the unrepresentable? Can we begin to have healing? For Dred Scott, who is at this very moment engaged in a performative reenactment of the rebellion in New Orleans as one of the biggest slave rebellions in history, as his counterpoint to conservative white reenactments of the Civil War, is engaged in this work of historic corrections. You see a lynching in the background and incarceration of Latinos and African Americans in the foreground. As he says, I make revolutionary art to propel history forward. Barbara Walker is an artist who takes police dockets, those dockets that are given to men and women who are stopped and searched and then become crumpled up. She blows them up to monumental, as she describes it, headstone size. As she says, I give voice to the voiceless and power to the powerless. Returning us back to Amazing Grace and the slave ship Brooks and its tight packing out of Liverpool, here Nari Ward, a Jamaican artist working in New York, takes baby strollers and speaks to families dispossessed in contemporary society by the legacy of slavery. Rashid Johnson is an artist working with homeless men in communities in Chicago who are engaged with their own strategies of self-imaging and self-imagining. Jonathan, here in this photograph, refuses to allow the viewer to see him and conceals his face in a moment of autonomy and authority reminiscent of Coyote. Here, Rashid Johnson himself mimics and recreates Frederick Douglass's famous portrait that I showed you moments before. Joyce Scott, an artist who spends her whole life committed to Douglass's last words, agitate, agitate, agitate. Here she recreates through tiny beaded sculptures a woman's beautiful hairstyling in the face of rape and struggle. Her mantra, stop raping, stop torturing, stop shooting. In 1892, at the moment when Britain, in a post-slavery era, but very much at the height of atrocities in colonization and empire building, Martha Ricks, a woman born into slavery in Tennessee, comes to visit Queen Victoria. When she visits Queen Victoria, she presents her with a liberty quilt. As she presents her with this quilt, she says of Windsor Castle and all its gold, all built so solid and so rich, as if it weren't that the end of the world were coming. Rosetta Douglas Spragg, the firstborn daughter of Frederick Douglass, inspired by her father, herself an activist, endlessly considered the question, real life is a struggle, an activity, a will to execute. And as Frederick Douglass himself said, and no more present than now, I have not lost either heart or hope. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Brooke Andrade has a microphone, so if you would raise your hand, she can come to you.
Thank you very kindly for your presentation this evening. And with your much work that have you done, what 2 or 3 quick stories that you have learned that you might be able to share with us at this time?
What kind of stories would you like?
Best ones, of course.
Oh, of course. We always want the best ones. Okay. One of the best ones would be, I spent a lot of my life working on Horace Pippin, who was a black combat soldier in World War I. And he's an artist on whom I found nothing was real. everything slipped away. And so he's an artist where we didn't know, he didn't have any photographs of him. We had misunderstood his family and his history. We thought his mother had saw John Brown. And what that was a great process was finding artwork that we didn't know about, that he painted in the front lines. So Horace Pippin is the only black combat soldier who painted in the front lines in the European trenches. And his 100 paintings were burnt up by censors. At the same time that we have the white official 8, the white artists, and their work is exhibited. So often the stories that I unpack are the stories that tell us these continuing inequalities. Horace Pippin, too, is an artist where we don't know his work, so we often misidentify it. So I was giving a talk in a very tiny village in England, thinking I'm all that, talking about Horace Pippin. I've been studying for 5 years. And a little old lady who's 89 comes up to me and she says, "Dear, that's not war-torn France." And I said, "Yeah, it is. It's been authenticated. It's war-torn France." I'm thinking, what does she know? And the next morning she sent me an email showing me it was the Rock of Cashel in Ireland. So we have these problems in understanding and verifying things. We make assumptions, we get it wrong all the time. And those questions and those failures often come with money that involves white power structures. So there's a lot at stake in thinking through these questions. A comedy moment to share is Frederick Douglass, where if you've got the big book, you'll see the big mistake, where we thought and we described Frederick Douglass and ladies in Haiti. Now, Douglass is wearing a huge overcoat. The women are wearing sweaters, and he talks endlessly in Haiti of, "I'm dying of the heat," and obviously we've now understood that it's Ireland. So we have there's a lot of things that have gone wrong in the trails of our research, but thank you for your question. I can share more with you personally.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. You talked a lot about the white supremacist representation of Black bodies, and I was wondering if you've done any study of Black bodies represented on digital media, like on the internet, and if there are any parallels or differences that you see in how Black people are represented in that medium versus in media that you showed tonight.
Thank you for your question. It's a beautiful one. Right, so it's the same old story, I have to say. So I don't show any of the vicious caricatures of Douglass, which were an industry in the 19th century. I'm saddened to say they're an industry today among white supremacist groups. Not going to be a surprise of any kind. The same tactics are used, the same grotesque caricature. One of the saddest moments I had in that project was the moment where Douglass wanted to take a publisher to court. So The Life and Times, his last narrative, he nearly stops publication, and he is so despairing. He writes 10 letters to his publisher, Sylvester Betts, and he says, "I dislike and disdain these grotesque and shocking woodcuts. They are an absolute abhorrent caricature of my face." The wood blocks, Douglass is famous, stay in. They're here for mortality. So Douglass, even at that moment of power, had no control. There were dolls, there were figures that were burnt, there were all kinds of, Douglass's skin was often corrupted in terms of his face was made to look bigger. He was often represented as toothless. He often had an eye missing. He was often short. So a lot of that industry of material is very much present today. One of the shocking misuses of Douglass is through Trump's administration, in the way that they've used his photograph in terms of so many things, but that's one angle of it. But everything under the sun that you can imagine of violence and violation that happened in 1619 happens in 2016. And there is no difference in type or form. There's just, as you're saying very powerfully, proliferation through digital media. There is a very disturbing other trend of ways in which Douglass is reproduced on objects and material culture, which I could talk about probably just one-on-one. But the industry is alive and kicking, and what was at stake in dehumanizing and the political benefit is still the same, I'm sad to say, which is why we need these images more than ever.
What a wonderful sea of images that you have given us. but they went by very fast.
Sorry.
And
As I'm always told off for that.
I missed the rifle in the shadow of Rene Cox. So I wanted to see that again.
So her interest is in kind of trying to recreate an automatic rifle shadow. That's what she's trying to do there.
Ah,
She did a whole series called Queen Nanny of the Maroons as well. So she's where she dresses as the British Redcoat. So she's very much about taking white power and subverting it through black feminist authority.
wonderful, thank you.
We can then adjourn to more informal conversation. Thank you, Professor Bernier.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.